We are in chapter 46, verse 26, continuing our discussion, our reading of the Torah passage. It says, Kol nefesh haba Yaakov Mitzrayim, all the souls that came with Jacob to Egypt, Yotzei Yerecho, that were issues from his loins. All of these descendants were Milvad Neshei B'nei Yaakov, aside from the wives of the sons of Jacob. Kol nefesh shishim l'sheish. All the souls were 66. Let's read the Rashi. Kol nefesh haba Yaakov. So actually, let's read what this Rashi says. Sheyatzu me'eretz Canaan. All the souls that came out of the land of Canaan, Avom u'Mitzrayim, to come to Egypt. Ve'ein haba zo lashon avar. This word haba is not in the past tense, and lashon hova in the present tense. And Rashi gives us a couple of examples, like ba'erev hiba, v'nei rachel bito ba'ar matzon, v'fikach tamo amata ba'al. Therefore, the emphasis is underneath the aleph. When they left to come to the land from the land of Canaan, they were only 66. But the second time Abba appears in this passage, then we're going to say, that's in verse 27, then we say, Vasheni, it says, Kol nefesh beit Yaakov haba Mitzrayim shivim, they were 70. That's Hulashon Avar, that's in the past, because Lefikach Tamu Amala, that's why its accent is on the second last syllable. And so therefore, Bebet, Ufisha Mishabao Sham Ayushivim, because by the time they got there were 70. Shemasu Sham Yosef Ushnei Banav, they found Yosef and his two sons there. Vinis Osfoam Yocheved, and Yocheved was born Bein Achomot, between the walls, like we discussed yesterday. With Divrei HaOmer, and according to Rabbi Yosef alluded to this yesterday, according to the position who states to Mot Noldu Imashvatim that there were twins that were born with every tribe. Every Shevet has a twin that was born with them. So where are these twins here? That's what he's asking. We'd have to say that they died before they came down to Egypt because they were not listed here. Or else, there's another answer why they're not listed. The other answer is because they only talked about the girls about whom there was something significant, like they were assaulted or they had the mother of Moses, but the girls who were just there, they weren't counted. That's another answer. Then Rashi says, Matzati b'Vayikra Rabba, I found in the Midrash Vayikra Rabba, Esav sheish nefashot hayulo. Esav had 6 souls in his daughter. V'akatuv koreotan nafshot beito. Yet the verse calls them the souls of his household in the plural. V'fishayu ovdin lelohut arbe, because they served many gods. Yaakov shivim hayu. Jacob had 70 souls, and the v'akasuv koreotan nefesh. The Torah calls them a soul. They worshipped one God. So Esav had 2 daughters. So the 6 souls are his 2 daughters and 4 sons. Okay. All right. Very interesting Rashi. Okay. Then Ubnei Yosef Asher Yulad Lo B'Mitzrayim, and the children of Joseph that were born to him in Egypt. Nefesh Shenayim. He had 2 souls. Kol Nefesh L'Beis Yaakov Haba Mitzrayim Shivim. Yaakov had a total of 70 because he had those 66 plus Yosef and the 2 sons, and Yocheved was born between the walls. And all those other girls who were born, Rashi says they must have died or else they didn't exist in the first place. Okay. Verse 28. Very, very important Rashi here. Very important Rashi. Yaakov sent Yehuda before him. El Yosef towards Joseph. L'orot lefanav Goshna. To Lahorot lefanav Goshna. We'll see what Rashi says that means. Lahorot lefanav, to set up before him Goshen. Vayavo arza Goshen. Judah came to the land of Goshen. What was Judah doing? Rashi says Kitar Gumo, like the Uncle states. What does it mean? Vayat Yudah Shalach kadmoi levat Yosef lefana kadmohi. So what does it means? Lefanat lo makom, to Rashi says lefana kadmoi legoshen, to make a place for him, meaning to say, to clear out the idolatry, and to instruct how we will settle it. Meaning to say that Yehuda was sent ahead to clear out the idolatry from the place and to study the Torah. Okay. Lefanav kodem she'agil Hashem, before he would get there. And now the Midrash tells us, L'orot lefanav v'taken lo beit Talmud shemisham teitzei hora'ah. Yehuda was sent to set up a beit Talmud, a house of Torah, a house of study. From there, the teachings would go forth. Meaning to say, Yaakov says, before we could go down to Egypt, to Goshen, we need to have a place to study Torah. Hold on one second. Okay. So there we go. So this is a very, very important Rashi, that Rashi is saying that Jacob, before he brought all the people down, he had to set up an educational institution. We see from here that the Jewish people cannot live in a place where there's no educational institution. And even before, he was worried about their physical security, their physical safety in the land of Goshen. Even before Rashi was worried about their physical safety, Yaakov was worried about their physical safety. First, we had to care for their spiritual safety. We see from this that as much as people think that the physical security is important, really the spiritual security is equally, if not more important, because otherwise, what are we fighting for? When you have, we can ask Steve to comment on this. When you have an army, if the army doesn't know what it's fighting for, the army is very weak. I don't care how many nuclear weapons they have. The army doesn't know what they're fighting for. We're on the 1-year anniversary of the Ukrainian war, Russia invading Ukraine. And there's a very clear difference between the people in Russia and Ukraine. The people in Ukraine can say in one sentence what they're fighting for. In Russia, I think it's much more complicated. But Steve, you have something to comment? Well, listen. No. Steve is an expert in this, as in so many other areas. Okay. Right. You got it right. Which part did I get right? When I said you're an expert, or? So sweet. Okay, fine. So Rashi says, Vayesor Yosef Merkavto Vayal Lekrot Yisrael Aviv Goshna. And Yosef went and he saddled his chariot and he went up to Israel, his father, in Goshen. Vayera Elav, and he appeared before him, Vayipal al Tzavarav, and he fell on his neck. Vayevk al Tzavarav Od, and he cried more on his neck. So Yosef falls on Yaakov's neck and cries. But unlike the verse with Benjamin, where it says Benjamin was crying on Yosef's neck, here it just tells us that Yosef is crying on Jacob's neck. What's Jacob doing? Look at the Rashi. Vayesor Yosef merkavto. Joseph harnessed his chariot. Hu atzmo asarat asusim. He himself harnessed the horses. Merkava, to the chariot. Lehiz dareis l'chvod aviv, to get there very quickly to honor his father. Joseph did it himself. Vayera elav Yosef nira elav. Joseph appears to his father. Vayevchal tzavarav od, and he wept on his neck excessively. Lishon harbot b'chiyah, excessive weeping. V'chein ki lo al ish yasim od. He did not put too much upon a man. Lashon miboyu, an expression of excessive. Eino sam olav alilut. He did not put false charges upon him. No safot al chata'av, in addition to his actual sins. Afghan, here Bavo Sif Bivchi. Joseph increased and added in his crying. Yoser al Ragil, more than the norm. Aval Yaakov nafal tzavarei Yosef. Yaakov did not fall on Yosef's neck. Yaakov did not kiss him. Amar Rabbi Seinu, our sages taught, Shayakorei es Shema. Yaakov was reciting the Shema. So he was reciting the Shema. Now, if you want to hear an explanation of it, you could go on the YouTube channel of Yeshiva Sali Melch and go to the short, and I say when Yaakov was reciting the Shema, and I'll share the explanation of the Dudai Ruvain. It's less than a minute, or you could see the whole shir today, which is a half hour where I discussed the Dudai Ruvain's explanation of why Yaakov was crying at that moment. Why Yaakov was reciting Shema at that moment that Yosef was crying. He couldn't have recited Shema a minute earlier. He had to recite it specifically at that moment. What's the symbolism of the Shema? And I addressed that there. Now we have here a footnote by the Kotzker Rebbe. When Yaakov saw Yosef, he experienced a great outpouring of love. He felt that he should channel this love towards God, so he immediately recited the Shema. That was another explanation. He wanted to channel the love that he feels for another human being directly into God. That was not the explanation of the Dudai Ruvain. That's the Kotzker's explanation. Okay. Vayomer Yisrael al Yosef. And then Israel says to Joseph, Amuta pa'am, I will die this time. Achrei ra'osias panecha, I've seen your face, ki otcha chai. Israel says to Joseph, now I can die after I've seen your face because you're still alive.
So why does he call him sometimes Yaakov, sometimes Yisrael?
Yeah, we haven't cracked that code. Why does the pasuk sometimes call him Yaakov and sometimes Yisrael? We have not cracked that code. We put out a call yesterday on the YouTube for anybody who hears this to respond, but we have not figured that out. So let's see if there's a Rashi. He says, Amusa pam, pshuto ketargumo. It's like the Targum says. What does the Targum say here? The Targum Uncle says, Iu ana mayet zimna hada menachet mana. If I were to die at this time, I would be consoled. So it doesn't mean I will die, it means I can die. Umidrasho savur hayisi lamut shtei mitot. I thought I was going to die 2 deaths in this world and in the world to come. Nistalka mimeni shchina, but then the divine presence departed from me. Vayiti omer, and I used to say, Shit ba'eni hakadosh baruch hu misasecha, and achshav she'otcha chai lo amut al pam achas. What is Rashi saying? He says, Jacob says, I used to think I would die 2 deaths in this world and the world to come because I didn't have the shchina, and I was saying that Hashem would claim your death from me, meaning to say Hashem would say that I was responsible for your death. But now that you're still alive, I'm only going to die once. Jacob had felt the guilt of being responsible for Yosef. He felt the guilt of being responsible for Yosef. So now the next verse states, Vayomer Yosef el achiv el beis aviv. Joseph said to his brothers and to the house of his father, Joseph said to his brothers and to his father, he says, I will go up and I will say to Pharaoh and I will say to him, my brothers and my father's home that are land of Canaan have come to me. She says, V'od omarlo. Rashi says, and I will also tell him that my brothers are shepherds. Meaning to say, Rashi is saying there are 2 statements being said here. He says, I will say to Paro, and furthermore, I will tell him something else. What's that further statement? That my brothers are shepherds, which is the next verse. And my brothers are shepherds. They're men of the cattle. And that they brought their sheep and their cattle. So Joseph is now prepping them for their meeting with the president. He's saying, when Pharaoh will call to you and he'll say to you, what's your job? Don't tell him that you're a SWAT team. Don't tell him that you're very good at agriculture, because then he's going to use you for his benefit. Mamartem, you should say to him, Anshe Migneayu, We're cattlemen. You have a dechaminur reign from our youth. You should tell them we've been cattlemen, cowboys from our youth. Why? Because this way we'll be able to live in the land of Goshen. Because Egyptians are not going to want to live with us because it's an abomination. It's an abomination. Everybody who's a shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians. Let's see what Rashi says. But he's going to need you because it's a land of pasture. So basically, Joseph's saying, you need to say this because when you tell him that you don't know anything else except for this, he's going to say, well, then you have to live far away from us. And Joseph was manipulating the situation because he wanted his family to stay together in the first ghetto on earth, which is the land of Goshen. Let's see what the footnote here is. Joseph tells his brothers that to tell Pharaoh that they're cattlemen, then they'll settle in Goshen. But why specifically Goshen? So Rashi explains Goshen is the land of pasture. If Pharaoh were to settle them outside of Egypt, that's the place he would settle them. And Rashi is also telling them to say we've been cattlemen from our youth till now. We don't know how to do anything else. We only know how to raise cattle. We're no good with the shovel. No good as farmers. Let's see, hold on. I saw somebody commented. Let's see. The chat. Maybe Jacob is called Israel when his higher nature is in play, and Yaakov when his earlier nature is at the forefront. And Israel when it's the nation is the subject, and Yaakov when it is his individual self. Yeah, that is one of the theories, but it doesn't always fit. But it is a good theory, but it doesn't fit in every situation. It really requires a lot of close analysis. I'm sure there's a lot of literature about it, but I'm just not familiar.
There's some evidence that the Jewish community on Elephantine Island in roughly 500 BC, in that period, got into trouble with the locals over sacrifice of animals in the temple. There was a temple in Elephantine. And the local Egyptians were quite opposed to it.
Because they didn't like animal sacrifices.
They didn't like anything about animals.
They were vegans.
They may have been.
Yeah.
They ate fish, but they didn't eat animals. Other kinds of land animals. So bottom line is that there was a kind of riots and a number of Jews were killed. And the temple that was there was partially destroyed. And there's evidence of that today in the archaeology.
Very interesting. So yeah, we could figure this out if we traveled to Egypt and we went down the path from Goshen to the Yam Suf. We could trace it.
Well, it's not so far from Goshen. It was thought to be Goshen and to the island, Elephantine.
Very interesting. So now it says, because everybody in Egypt who guarded sheep was a toavat mitzrayim. It was, and they translate as an abomination. The fisha heim lahem. This goes to what Steve was talking about. The fisha heim lahem Elohut, because they view this as their god. So the Zohar says abomination toevot is a euphemism for pagan deity, meaning to say the Egyptians, the opposite of the way we read it, but because the sheep are a god to the Egyptians, that's what Rashi was saying. Therefore, the shepherds were a kind of servants to God, and so therefore the shepherds were themselves a form of gods. That's why Pharaoh gave Goshen, which is the best of the land. We had read it. The simple reading of the verse is that it was abominable. But what Rashi and the Zohar are saying is that it was actually just the opposite. The shepherds were the holiest, and because they were guarding the animals. But others say that it was just the opposite, because the shepherds lack respect for sheep. therefore the shepherds are abominable. So you could read it either way, but the Zohar reads it as the shepherds are the holiest, whereas the Sifsei Chachamim reads it as the shepherds are the lowest in the eyes of the Egyptians. You were trying to say something, Steve? I cut you off?
No,
Okay.
no, I just was thinking as later why the Jews living, near the center, near the Egyptian temples and whatnot, they must not have, they obviously did some sacrifices, and the Egyptians tolerated it. So it's an interesting question.
Yeah.
I mean, if you slaughtering the lambs would be just an example.
Well, the Torah talks about that when they do the Paschal lamb sacrifice.
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
And it's a contradiction, isn't it?
Well, that's what some say, that the main reason why they had to do this Paschal lamb sacrifice was to slaughter the deity of the Egyptians in order to assert their freedom. That's what Ramban says. So let's start chapter 47. Vayavo Yosef Vayigash Pharaoh Vayomer Avi v'Achai v'Tzonam Karam V'Kol Shalaim Ba'al Me'eretz Canaan V'Inam Be'eretz Goshen. Joseph came and he said to Pharaoh, he said, my father and my brothers and their sheep and their cattle and everything that belongs to them have come to Canaan, and now they are in the land of Goshen. Umiktzei achav lakach chamisha anashim v'yatzigim l'fnei Paro. And from the weakest of his brothers, well, from the edge of his brothers, we'll see what Rashi says. He took 5 men and he put them before Pharaoh. We'll see what Rashi says. Mina pechutim shemahem l'gvura, from the weakest of them. She'ein nirim giburim, he didn't want them to look mighty. Why did he take the 5 weakest brothers? Shem yireu some giburim, if Pharaoh were to view them as mighty, ya'aseu some on Shem al-Chama, he said, I need warriors, I need soldiers. Ve'elaim, these are the weakest brothers. Reuven, Levi, Yisachar, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yisachar, Benyamin. O son shall kafam Moshe shmotam, keshabirchan. Those were the names of Moses when he blessed them in the end of Zosa Bracha, did not double their names. Aval Shmot HaGiborim, but the names of the mighty ones, the names of the strong ones, Kafal, Moshe doubled their names, as it says in Zota Bracha, V'Shama Kol V'Zosu Yehuda, Shama Hashem Kol Yehuda. U'Gad Amar Baruch Marchiv Gad, U'Naftali Amar Naftali. V'chein lo Zvulun u'Adan Amar Dan. V'chein lo Zvulun v'chein lo Asher. Zeu Hashem Bereshet Rabbah. She Agadat Eretz Yisrael. So first of all, we're going to get to that last phrase in a second. Now, the implication is, before we get to that last phrase, which is itself pregnant with meaning, Rashi is telling us that Yosef was manipulating the situation because he wanted Paro to think that they're not worthy of going into battle, because they are the weakest of the weakest, and therefore he manipulated so Paro only saw the weakest tribes. But we see from here that already at this moment in history, where everybody thinks this is their strong point, Joseph is taking care of his brothers. Joseph is nothing. He has no control. Paro could take them and do whatever they want with them at this point. So already they're almost in a slavery at this point. They're not in control of the situation. Paro could do a draft and take them all. And Joseph, therefore, has to be very, very, very careful. You have to be very careful what you say, very careful who goes before him. And Joseph was very afraid that Paro would manipulate this situation. This is a tell. This is a tell that Joseph knows that he's not in charge. He might pretend he's in charge. He might walk around like he's in charge, but he's not in charge. He is not in charge. Now, Rashi also throws in something here. This is the language of Bereshit Rabbah, which is the Agadah of the land of Israel. That's unusual. So why does he put that in? Rashi is teaching us that the Midrash Rabbah was redacted by Rabbi Yochanan, the head of the yeshiva in Tveria. So, or Rav Hoshaya. But it's very interesting. Rashi's just teaching us this at this point here. Okay.
Have you been familiar with the Yerushalmi?
Rashi would have been familiar with select passages from the Jerusalem Talmud, but perhaps not the entire Jerusalem Talmud. but select passages from the Jerusalem Talmud he would have been familiar with. I mean, the Jerusalem Talmud was not widely cited until later. They didn't have the standard.
It's only mentioned 8 times in all of Rashi on the Talmud.
How many times?
8.
In the Rashi on the Gemara. But what about Rashi on the Torah?
I don't know.
Okay, 8 times. Okay, so he mentions it 8 times. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he didn't have it, because Rashi was basically, his job was to comment on the text of the Talmud in front of him. So he wasn't looking to bring in other passages as proofs or as questions and as contradictory sources, which is what the Jerusalem Talmud would be. So he didn't fit in with his reason. Like Rashi, doesn't mean he doesn't know it. I'm going to give you another example, a shocking example. At the time that Rashi was living in Troyes, he was the greatest, obviously the greatest rabbinic sage in northern France at that time. But he lived in the town of Troyes, very, very small town. And in this very, very small town of Troyes, at the same time, was the greatest French writer at the time. He was known for being he was the most popular, I wouldn't say greatest, Chrétien de Troyes. They had to live within 1,000 feet of each other, but obviously nobody ever quotes each other because they had no reason to. So, but they were the two greatest in their traditions. Okay. Then Rashi says, Matzino she'osan she'kafal Moshe she'mosan hayu achal Hashem. He says just the opposite. We find the opposite in the Bavli. We're reading the Rashi to chapter 47, verse 2. In the Bavli, we find that those names that Moshe Rabbeinu doubled in the book of Devarim at the end, in Zosa Bracha, Ayu Achal Hashem, they were the weak ones. And those were the ones, and it was those whom Yosef brought before Paro. Meaning to say, he brought the ones, the opposite, the ones who were doubled. The Yehuda shehuchbal shmo, but why? So the problem with that is Yehuda's name was doubled. Why? Lo huchbal mishum charashus. But Yehuda was obviously not the weakest, so why was Yehuda's name doubled? It wasn't because he was weak. Ela tam yesh badavar, but there's another reason. The Isa b'Bava Kama, Mebraisa de Sefri, Shaninu b'Zosa Bracha, Kemo Talmud Shalani. And he said, and Rashi just refers to, like we learned in Bava Kama and the Braisa of the Sefri, and we learn like our Talmud. So what does it say in Bava Kama? According to the Gemara there, Judah is mentioned twice because the first time Moshe was davening, that Yehuda said he had taken a vow upon himself that if Binyamin is not returned and he'll be banished, that be annulled. And the second time he's mentioned, it is the Moshe's davening was accepted. And according to the Sifri, okay, fine. So that's the reason why Yehuda's name is mentioned twice, but otherwise the people's names are mentioned twice were the weakest. Because if you're going to say Shimon and Levi were the weakest, you have a problem because they knocked out the whole town of Shlem. And Reuben was the oldest. So it's a big problem. Okay, so that's why Rashi goes that approach, and we'll stop here and daven mincha. Everybody will stop here and daven mincha. Shkoyach.